Hello, Omaha, and welcome to Keep Moving Forward, a table talk for the City of Omaha Human Rights and Relations Department. I'm Lori O'Brien.
And I'm Laura Aite. We work in the Civil Rights Enforcement Division of our department, which is responsible for the investigation of complaints of discrimination under federal and local laws. These laws protect individuals from discrimination in housing, employment, and places of public accommodation. If you believe you have experienced discrimination or simply need more information on your rights, please contact our office at 402-444-5055, or you can visit our website at www.humanrights.cityofomaha.org.
And thank you for joining us last month when we met with local LGBTQ+ advocate Eli Rigutuso. And today we'll be discussing how COVID-19 applies to employment laws.
Right, this has definitely been a hot topic since the start of the pandemic.
Right.
And the EEOC did issue guidance on COVID-related issues in the workplace at the start of the pandemic, and they recently updated that. So we'll be discussing that today. And one of questions that we often get is, are employers allowed to ask employees about COVID-related symptoms? And according to the EEOC, the answer is yes. Employers are permitted to ask employees who will be physically entering the workplace if they have COVID-19 or if they have symptoms associated with COVID-19. And they can also ask if they've been tested for COVID.
Right.
As most people know, symptoms associated with COVID-19 include fever, chills, cough, and shortness of breath. But there could be more, and if anyone needs more information on that, it can be found on the CDC's website. Another important thing is that employers can exclude individuals with COVID-19 or even associated symptoms from the workplace. And the basis for this is found under the ADA,
Right.
the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yes.
Which is one of the anti-discrimination laws for employment. And under the ADA, a direct threat means that an individual's medical condition poses a significant risk of substantial harm to himself or others. And so the EEOC has determined that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, individuals with COVID-19 or associated symptoms would constitute a direct threat to both themselves and any other individuals they come in contact with. And so, based on that, employers can ask those questions or exclude employees from the workplace.
Right. Right.
Yeah, when they have an active case.
Right.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another hot topic, as you mentioned, Laura, is testing.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and I just want to start off beginning by saying that there is information about testing sites around the City of Omaha. You can call 211, or you can visit the City of Omaha website at www.cityofomaha.org, and then you can click on the link at the top for Douglas County, which has the most up-to-date information about testing sites around the City of Omaha. We are not medical experts. We don't want to give out information about where to go to get testing and what types of testing is available, but that information is available to you. And it's important to be proactive.
Yeah, I agree.
About this.
Yeah.
About COVID testing. But as far as employment laws and COVID testing, employers are allowed to administer the COVID-19 viral test or require that an employee receives a negative test before initially permitting them to enter the workplace, and or periodically to determine if their presence in the workplace poses a direct threat to others. And that's important to know. A direct threat is what they're looking for. The ADA does not interfere with the employer's following recommendations by the CDC or other public health authorities regarding whether, when, and for whom the testing or other screening is appropriate. Testing administered by employers consistent with current CDC guidelines will meet the ADA's business necessities standard. The tests are also required to be accurate and reliable, so employers are encouraged to periodically review recommendations and guidance for updates or changes. So I think it's important for employers to always look at the EEOC website or the CDC's website for that information. Employers may also wish to consider the incidence of false positive or false negatives associated with a particular test. And I think that's something we hear a lot about.
That's true. Yeah.
So note that a positive test results reveal that an individual most likely has a current infection and may be able to transmit the virus to others. A negative test result means the individual did not have a detectable COVID-19 at the time of testing, and there might be some follow-up that needs to be looked at. And I think a takeaway is for employees to be proactive and informed, and really the responsibility falls on the employee with testing and not necessarily the employer. So
Right.
that's a message that I think we need to give to them.
Right, yeah. Yeah, if an employer requires testing, they don't necessarily have to provide it, but
Right.
they can administer it, and many do. And as Lori, you stated, we're not medical experts, so
Right.
a lot of the information that we're discussing today comes from the EEOC, the
Yes.
CDC, and they also reference the FDA.
Right.
And so if anyone out there has specific questions about the test or about vaccines, which we'll discuss later, the vaccine information can be found on the FDA's website
Right.
too. So
And I get some calls too, and I think it's important to check with your HR department. Sometimes they will give you vouchers for
Right.
testing. I think that's sometimes it has been extended for some businesses.
right,
So check with your HR department to see if that's still available,
Yeah.
if it's free to be tested, because looks like it's gonna continue for a while. So make sure to check to see if that's available to you before you go.
right. Yeah, good idea.
Yes.
Yeah. So moving on, we wanted to quickly touch on protective gear.
Yes.
Now, specifically face coverings.
Yes.
As most people know, the City of Omaha does not currently have a face covering mandate citywide. However, even though that doesn't exist at the current time, an employer can still require their employees to wear protective gear, which would include masks and gloves.
Right.
But that's not the only types of protective gear that can be required. And they can also require their employees to observe infection control protocols. So this would include things like regular hand washing and social distancing protocols. It's also important for both employers and employees to know that some employees may need religious accommodations or disability-related reasonable accommodations to these policies, which we will discuss shortly here.
Absolutely. And we get a lot of calls about those as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And another hot topic is vaccinations. So that's something that we wanted to touch base about as well. The federal equal employment opportunity laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19 as long as they follow the accommodation provisions of Title VII, the ADA, and other EEO laws. And I know that I have gotten calls about that as well. Employees asking if that is permitted from for their employers to ask them of that.
Yeah, and that was kind of recently updated
Yes.
by the EEOC since the vaccines became widely available, right? And I think maybe recently approved by the FDA other than the emergency use.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
right.
again, that specific information would need to come from the FDA in terms of emergency use authorization
Yes.
or official approval.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if anyone
Yeah.
has questions about that.
Yes, good point, Laura. Absolutely. And then another question that we get is if an employer requires verification of an employee's
Right.
COVID-19 vaccination. And sometimes they want, they request to see that vaccination card.
Right.
Or records, to see if an employee got vaccinated, and they ask maybe directly, let me see that, or I want your records. They might want to ask the doctor directly for that verification. It might be easier just to ask the employee to say, bring your records to me instead of going through the hoops and talking to the doctor. Because if they want to talk to the doctor themselves, if the employer wants to talk to the doctor themselves, they're going to have the employee fill out a authorization form that, because of HIPAA guidelines, they can't speak to the doctor directly without the consent of the employee. So it might be easier just to have the employee bring that form,
Right.
the records themselves, because there is protection, so.
Yeah, and that should be acceptable, the record that the employee has to verify that they've received the vaccine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when you get your vaccination, you get that card.
Right.
So
yeah. Standard card that everybody gets.
Right, that should be enough.
Yeah, but they can require the verification
Absolutely.
of the vaccine.
Absolutely.
From the if they have a policy that requires vaccinations.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So I just mentioned earlier that some employees might need reasonable accommodations.
Yes.
And so reasonable accommodations, again, fall under the ADA. And according to the ADA, a reasonable accommodation is an adjustment or modification that's provided by an employer to provide employees with disabilities an opportunity to enjoy equal employment opportunities. And so if a reasonable accommodation that is needed for an employee to do things such as apply for a job, perform a job, or enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment, the employer must provide it unless that accommodation would pose what's called an undue hardship. And under the ADA, an undue hardship is a significant difficulty or expense, right? Employers should also know that they do have the discretion to choose among effective employee accommodations. So if the accommodation that's requested from the employee would result in an undue hardship, the employer needs to offer an alternative accommodation if one is available.
Right.
And the determination of the requested accommodation, whether that constitutes an undue hardship, is a fairly complicated process when it relates to disability and the ADA.
Right.
And so, if anyone has questions about that, it might be advisable to seek legal advice or legal guidance before making a determination.
Yes.
For employers. And so, in regards to COVID-19, employees with disabilities may need COVID-19 related reasonable accommodations. So some examples of this would be an exception to an employer's vaccination requirement, which would allow the employee to instead use masks, social distancing, schedule changes, or reassignment to stay safe at work. Now, those are just some examples. It depends on the nature of the employment and the business.
Right.
Employees might also need exceptions to other safety protocols, such as needing non-latex gloves, modified face masks for interpreters or other individuals who communicate with an employee who uses lip reading, or even gowns that are designed for individuals who use wheelchairs. Now, those are just some examples, and it's not an exhaustive list. It's also important for employers to know that they need to engage in what's called the interactive process. And that's basically a discussion about an employee's disability and need for accommodation that the employer has with the employee. And what that might include is that if the employee's disability and need for the accommodation is not obvious or already known, the employer may ask questions and request documentation to determine whether the employee has a disability as defined by the ADA. And under the ADA, a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity or a history of substantially limiting impairment. So they can request information and records to determine if the individual requesting the accommodation meets that definition. They can also request information and records to determine whether the disability necessitates the requested accommodation. So again, it's a fairly complicated process, and if anyone has questions, they could consult legal advice or visit the EEOC's website.
And now I'll touch base about the religious accommodation part of that. So employees who have a sincere religious, ethical, or moral belief may also request a reasonable accommodation under Title VII if that employee's sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance conflicts with the employer's policy or procedure, just like what Laura touched on, a disability-related accommodation. The employer must provide effective accommodation unless doing so would constitute an undue hardship. The undue hardship under Title VII is a lower standard than that under the ADA, what Laura just went over. So an undue hardship determination in regards to a religious accommodation is typically defined as requiring more than minimal cost or burden on the employer based on their resources and operation of the business. So it's a little bit lower standard, and that's something that the employee and employer would have to go over. And it's an interactive process just like under the ADA. In relation to COVID-19, religious accommodation requests may include exemptions from vaccination requirements. This would include modified equipment due to religious garb, or a request to wait until an alternative version or specific brand of COVID-19 vaccination is available to the employee. So we've heard about cases in that regard as well, that employees want to wait to a specific kind of COVID vaccination is available, and have requested a accommodation in that regards too. So again, it's just important to know that once a person requests a religious accommodation, there is an interactive process that needs to take place. And I think it's just important for everybody to be, again, informed about what that entails, and to seek some legal guidance, or contact the EEOC if there's any questions.
Right. And also equally important regarding religious accommodations is to understand the definition of religion.
Yes.
And so this is under Title VII.
Right.
And the definition of religion is broad.
Absolutely.
Under
Yes.
Title VII. And so the EEOC's guidance suggests that employers should ordinarily just assume that an employee's request for religious accommodations is based on a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. And so they should also thoroughly consider all reasonable accommodations for both religion and disability. This could include things like telework, reassignment, and in many circumstances it could be possible to accommodate those seeking reasonable accommodations for their religious beliefs, practices, and observances. And I think in general, for both religious and reasonable accommodations, employers, when it relates to vaccines, employers should encourage employees to get the vaccine rather than requiring them to do it.
Right, right.
Due to the need to provide these accommodations. And so that is it's really a new topic. And so this is guidance from the EEOC, right? But we've kind of yet to see any actual court cases or any rulings from the court in terms of COVID-related vaccines.
We've seen them with the
and
flu.
Yeah, right.
Yes,
there have been some about the influenza vaccine in the
Yes.
past, but
Right.
it might be different going forward because we're in a pandemic and with the COVID-19 vaccine. So we will see how that's going to play out if any cases do reach the courts.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes. And now we're going to talk about medical inquiries. The ADA also has restrictions on when and how much medical information an employer may obtain from an applicant or an employee, known as disability-related inquiry or a medical exam. Once an employee begins work, these must be job-related and consistent with business necessities. So I know that people have questions on, does an employer have a right to, how much information does an employer have a right to know about my disability-related records, information? How much can I tell them? Do they have a right to take my temperature, ask questions about my symptoms and such? The EEOC has determined that a COVID-19 antibody test constitutes a medical examination and at this time does not meet the ADA's job-related and consistent with business necessity standard for medical examinations or inquiries for current employees. Therefore, it's requiring an antibody testing before allowing an employee to re-enter the workplace is not allowed under the ADA. And also, it should be noted that antibody tests are distinct from the viral or PCR test, which determines if a person has an active case of COVID. So these all fall under the medical inquiries, and
Right, and it's a different, as you mentioned it, the antibody test is different
Yes.
from the PCR test,
Right.
which I think we had just mentioned earlier.
Yes.
The diagnostical testing, they are allowed to require
Yes.
that because they've determined that because it's used to diagnose whether a person has a current infection,
Yes.
then it does meet the business necessity standard for a medical inquiry.
Right.
But according to the EEOC, the CDC, has said that antibody tests shouldn't be used to
Right.
diagnose COVID.
right.
And so I think that's why the EEOC determined that antibody tests, they don't meet that standard
Right.
for a medical inquiry, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think we're all used to going to businesses or health, or I guess our medical doctors, getting asked those standard 4 questions.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and get our temperature taken.
Yes, right.
Yes,
That's
so
for sure.
those would fall, those are okay, but
Yeah.
anything beyond.
So complicated, sometimes a confusing process or the information, but ultimately it's also important for everyone to know that the guidance from the public health authorities is likely to change, and it has changed over
Yes.
as the pandemic evolves, and thus guidance or even if we see court rulings regarding COVID-19 related issues in employment, that also might be updated and changed, as the EEOC recently updated some of these policies. And so employers should, as you I think stated earlier, follow the EEOC, CDC, FDA to make sure that they are aware of the most current information relating to workplace safety.
Absolutely. And the EEOC website has a handbook that you can download. And, if you have any questions, you can download it. And like you said, it's going to be updated, but just for a reference guide to have that with you.
Right. That's
I think
a great idea.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
important to have.
Yeah. And, we've gotten quite a few calls
Yes.
about this too, and we do provide references and
Absolutely.
referrals to individuals who call.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to tune in again next month. And lastly, if you believe that you have been a victim of discrimination, please contact our office at 402-444-5055 or visit our website at humanrights.cityofomaha.org. I'm Lori O'Brien.
And I'm Laura Aite, and this has been Keep Moving Forward.